Good morning, everybody. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you all. I know I've already been introduced, but I wanted to give just a little more background on myself and my work to help contextualize my remarks this morning. I'm speaking about where do we go from Roe, so I want to give a little sense of where I've been. I'm a journalist. I've been covering politics for about 7 years now. I've covered several major elections, but most of my work has focused on abortion policy and the pro-life movement. And like Sarah mentioned, last summer I co-authored a book with Ryan Anderson on the abortion debate, which came out just a few days after the Dobbs decision, which we tried to time, but it was almost perfect timing the way it worked out. So I've been giving talks about abortion and the pro-life movement across the country for about 5 years now. And for most of that time, much of my talks have focused on Roe v. Wade, right? How do we operate as pro-life Americans when the Supreme Court has really handcuffed us? How do we protect unborn children with Roe in place? And how do we work to get the court to overturn Roe? And now here we are. We're at a remarkable moment in the history of the pro-life movement. The Supreme Court has finally abolished one of the most unjust decisions in its history, and it rightly recognized that Roe was deeply unconstitutional and that our Constitution, in fact, never protected any right to abortion at all. And by doing so, the court finally permitted every state in our country to begin protecting unborn children from the violence of abortion. This was a major, major victory. It was brought about by, tireless work and prayers of millions of Americans over the past 5 decades. But I think what we knew even before that decision, and what we've certainly seen bear out over the course of the past year or so, is that victory was not the end of those work or the need for those prayers. As wonderful as the decision was, as necessary as it was to get to this new stage, the fight over abortion in our country is in fact far from over, and that's, of course, what you're hearing about in this conference. And so what I'm going to talk about today is how do we think about where we are now, and how do we kind of sketch a roadmap to where we want to be in the future. I think the end of Roe was really not the end of the abortion debate, right? All of our energy up to Roe was focused on this court case, but the end of Roe really marked the new phase of a fight over abortion. So what I want to focus on today is this central question. How should pro-life Americans approach this new era? How should we be thinking? What should we be working on? And I want to share some thoughts that I hope will help you consider how pro-lifers can be the best witnesses possible to building the kind of pro-life society we need in order to make abortion illegal and unthinkable. So the one thing that I think is most important to keep in mind when it comes to this debate is that ending abortion in our country is going to require not only effectively arguing against abortion, but also working to build an affirmatively pro-life society, the kind of society where all of our fellow Americans recognize that it's wrong to take the life of a human being in the womb. Abortion is a grave moral evil. Of course, we should argue against it, but I think we can't unsee evil merely by naming it and attacking it. I think it's most powerful when we also have something to say about the good. In other words, we have to be able to explain that abortion is wrong because life is good. This is something that Ryan and I write about in our book, which, as Sarah mentioned, is titled Tearing Us Apart, How Abortion Harms Everything and Solves Nothing. That subtitle is really the focus of my talk today. I think that contains a really important truth that pro-lifers don't think about perhaps as much, and that we should keep in mind. Advocates of legal abortion argued before Roe, they argued over the past 50 years, and they still argue today that abortion is a problem solver, right? This is the number one argument for abortion. And they argued that abortion would improve our society, it would set people free, it would in particular help women. But if we look back at the last 50 years and look at the track record, I think we can see abortion hasn't actually solved anything. And in fact, it's made many things much worse. It's been deeply harmful, not only and most obviously to unborn children, but to our entire society. So that's the broad argument in our book. Abortion has destroyed unborn children, relationships between men and women, marriages, families, our medical profession, our politics, our law, and our culture. So I think where do we go from here? The answer is learning to speak about these many harms of abortion and these many victims of abortion will be the key to the pro-life movement's success in a post-Roe v. Wade country. We have to get excellent at explaining why we believe abortion is wrong. We already know how to explain that the creature in the womb is a human being. We know how to explain that every human being has dignity and sanctity even in the womb. We know how to explain that human beings are created in the image and likeness of God if we're Christians. We know how to explain that just governments should protect all human beings from lethal violence. I think it's crucial to make these arguments, but we also have to make a broader argument. So this is where our book came in, and we tried to time it to come out around Dobbs so that pro-lifers would have this sort of new argument. If it's true, in fact, that abortion is an act of violence against these innocent human beings in the womb, think about what that must mean for our entire society. For 50 years now, it has been legal across our entire country to take the lives of millions and millions of innocent human beings, and in many states, unfortunately, it remains legal today. So how could this reality not harm everything that it touches? How could it not harm all of us to live in a society where this is true? How can we thrive as a community if we attempt to solve our problems by committing violence against the most vulnerable and needy members of the human family? We simply can't, right? And so it must be the case that legalized abortion has, in some very deep and moral sense, too, moral and spiritual sense, harmed all of us. So we make that case in our book. The first chapter focuses on the harm of abortion to the unborn child, learning how to make the scientific, the ethical, the philosophical case against abortion as a morally unjust thing. But we also argue that it has harmed women, marriages, and families. It's harmed social equality, right? Abortion has targeted minorities, it's targeted the poor, the disabled, other Americans who are already marginalized. It's harmed our medical system. Right? It's mainstreamed this notion that somehow killing a human being in the womb is healthcare, or is a good thing for women's health. It's harmed the rule of law, it's harmed our politics. I hardly need to explain that. And we argue pro-lifers need to learn how to explain all of this, because unfortunately there are very many people out there who are not convinced by the argument that abortion kills an innocent human being. Right? They might say, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, I don't care. And so we have to learn how to take the argument further. On the other side, there's not much of a positive case for abortion at all. I think the arguments we've seen from abortion supporters in the wake of Dobbs suggest as much. It's been close to a year now since the ruling came down, and I have yet to see a single solid argument, a positive argument, on behalf of the left's preferred abortion policy. Rarely do they provide a substantive argument for why unlimited abortion through all 9 months of pregnancy for any reason is a good policy. I don't think I could name a single good argument I've seen for that. Instead, what we've witnessed is they've tried to put pro-lifers on defense, right? They've tried to claim that pro-life laws will make it impossible for women to get health care in difficult medical situations. In reality, that simply is not the case. Every pro-life law in the entire country allows doctors to protect the life and health of pregnant mothers in life-threatening situations. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go and find every single one of these laws online, read the text, and see that the exceptions are there, the protections are there. Or, I've written articles on it if you're curious, compiling the text of all these laws. Pro-life laws do not prohibit giving life-saving care to women. They prohibit one thing only: directly and intentionally killing the unborn child. They prohibit abortion. And it's precisely because the other side doesn't want to defend their position that they've worked so hard to focus on mischaracterizing pro-life laws. What does that mean for pro-lifers as we look to the future? For one thing, I think it means we're correct to say that abortion is a bad thing, that it's not actually a solution to anyone's problems, because not even its most vocal advocates want to defend abortion on its own terms. So instead, what do they argue? What I typically see is they argue women need this. Women need abortion. That's their most common, most powerful argument. So what I want to suggest is that for pro-lifers, this is the fundamental argument we need to learn how to reject. We have to be able to explain that abortion is bad for women, too. Many, many women who've had abortion suffer alone and in silence for years, too afraid to tell anybody what they did. Many suffer crippling guilt and regret. Some even have more severe psychological struggles. They struggle with drug abuse, alcohol abuse, or even suicide. I think these women deserve the compassion and support of the pro-life movement. This should be a bigger part of what we do, although it already is in some ways. And sadly, many supporters of abortion ignore or even attack these women when they share their stories of having suffered after having an abortion. I find, unfortunately, it's very rare to find an abortion supporter who will take seriously the fact that many women come to regret their abortions. And as sad as that is, it makes sense on a logical level, right? The suffering of these women undermines the claim that women need abortion, or that abortion is good for women, or that it solves women's problems. What I often say in arguments or in conversations with people who make these arguments is, how could it be the case, truly, that women need to commit violence against their own children in order to save themselves, or to be better off for having done so? I think if that is actually true of our society, I don't believe it is, but if it were actually true of our society, that women need to commit violence against their own children to save themselves, then we're facing a set of problems as a society that abortion could never hope to solve. And in the past, when I've been in debates with abortion supporters on this point, I'm often told it doesn't even matter what abortion actually is, right? My argument is always, we can't know if abortion is good for women until we're willing to admit what happens in an abortion, right? Is someone killed? Is there a human being there? And my opponents dismiss that. They say it doesn't matter what or who is in the mother's womb because women need abortion. They won't even acknowledge these scientific, moral, philosophical questions because they believe so deeply and so strongly that women need abortion in order to be fully human. I think we can't fully understand this mindset unless we think a little bit about the roots of modern feminism. Interestingly, if you know the history of early feminism, women who called themselves feminists in the early 20th century were, without known exception, opposed to abortion. They certainly believed that abortion was immoral because it took a human life, but they also argued that it was bad for women. They argued that abortion placed the responsibilities of pregnancy and childbearing and child rearing even more on a woman's shoulders than they had been before that, because it absolved fathers of responsibility, rather than requiring fathers in society to do more to support mothers and children. In other words, they thought abortion was an easy way out for a society that was already inclined to place too many burdens on women. It was only around the time of the sexual revolution that this mindset began to change among feminists. Our society began to prize this notion of supposedly consequence-free sex as a necessary aspect of being human, or of human flourishing. And so around this time, we witnessed, thinkers who thought of themselves as feminists, they began to believe that in fact true liberation did require consequence-free sex. And so they began to argue in turn that there's something deficient or even oppressive about women's bodies, because women's bodies make that goal impossible. Think about it this way. It's a simple fact, although a lot of people try to deny it, that sex can lead to pregnancy. And it's a simple fact, although more and more people are denying this too, that women get pregnant and men don't. And so the unchangeable realities of biology make it impossible for women to participate in sex the way that men can. That's just not how it works. Men have this biological ability to walk away as though nothing happened, although of course they shouldn't. They can. And women, if they become pregnant, can't do that. So what did this mean for feminism? Because with the sexual revolution, our society had changed its mindset on all of this, women's rights advocates actually began in a perverse way to hate their own bodies. They began to see their bodies, the female body, as an obstacle to fulfillment, and in fact, a roadblock to equality with men. And so around this time, quite naturally, contraception and abortion became necessary to control female fertility and eliminate children if they happened to arise, so that women could pretend that they were walking away with the same freedom that men have. There are a lot of problems with this. I think one of the big ones is there's a really uncomfortable hatred for women inherent in this whole worldview. Abortion stems from a very deeply anti-woman philosophy, this mindset that prizes the male mode of embodiment and being human and sees the female mode as somehow deficient or less than or secondary. This philosophy also takes the fact of male abandonment as the standard, right? It sees the fact that men are able to walk away, and it sees the fact that men often do walk away, and it turns that ability into the ideal, right? Instead of demanding that men don't abandon women and children, that they support women and children, this worldview actually demands that women be let in on the ability to abandon those who rely on them. There's another problem with this. Abortion, of course, doesn't actually solve the female body. It doesn't magically turn women into men. It requires women to participate in violence against their own children in order to pretend that they're operating in the same way that men can. This is not actually a solution for women. It's another form of oppression. So what does this backstory mean for pro-lifers after Dobbs? I think it means that our project, our argument, just got a lot bigger. If our major goal is to protect unborn children from abortion, that project fits within a larger one. I think that protecting unborn children is going to require going right to the root of the sexual revolution and rejecting it. Let me give you an example. In the days and weeks after the Supreme Court overturned Roe, my social media feeds were full of young women around my age talking as though the world had just ended. I saw women posting about how they no longer had any rights, about how the government wants to control their bodies, about how men are now more human or have more freedom than women in the United States. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because while I think these women are, of course, very misguided, they're deeply sincere in this belief, and I wanted to understand why they think that way. How did it happen that so many women became convinced that their humanity, their freedom, was tied to their ability to kill their own unborn children? I think it's because of the sexual revolution and the way feminism changed as a result of it. Women today believe they need abortion because our society prizes sex with no consequences. Right? We live in a society that has decided that the female body is deficient and that pregnancy and childbearing are, at least some of the time, unwelcome burdens for both men and women. And children in this view are valuable only when they're wanted. You can see how abortion follows from this mindset, right? Sex is for recreation only, and we can disconnect children with ease if we want to just enjoy ourselves without bringing new life into the world. I think this is a philosophy of very radical and almost anti-human independence, right? None of us owes each other anything. That's why this worldview rejects the unborn child and rejects the idea of parental responsibility to the unborn child. This idea of radical independence requires setting men free from the burden of women and children, and then turning around and setting women free from the burden of pregnancy and motherhood. But in reality, I think, because of what human nature is, the idea that we could ever participate in sex with no strings attached was always a fiction. In reality, we know that sex tells a story of human interdependence and of reliance on one another. Each of us depends on our mother and father and on God to bring our life into being in the first place. None of us created himself. Each of us depends on our mother to carry us in her womb and give birth to us. And so I think the world in which abortion kind of facilitates freedom and fulfillment is a world that can never exist, simply because of the reality of human nature. It was never possible for us to live fulfilled as entirely independent creatures, able to follow our whims without experiencing suffering or natural consequences. So where does that leave us as people with a role to play in building a pro-life future? I think it means we have to learn to talk about abortion not only as violence against the unborn child, but as one major problem that stems from a bigger false anthropology, a false view of what it means to be human. We have to make the case that women don't need abortion, and that abortion actually harms women and men. We have to make the case that the sexual revolution has created a society living a giant lie, the lie that human beings can use and destroy one another if it brings us momentary pleasure. Let me give you two concrete examples of what this looks like in practice. First, we know from statistics that a huge number of women who seek abortions say that they're doing so either because they aren't being supported by the father of their child, or because the father of their child is pressuring them or coercing them into abortion. And second, we know that only a small percentage of unborn children killed by abortion in this country are conceived within the context of marriage. This tells us something important, right? Building strong commitments between husbands and wives who are then committed to raising their children together is the best possible way to build a pro-life society that protects unborn children. Now, that's a big goal, of course, right? Changing a culture isn't easy. Most of what I've said, I think, will take long-term commitment, as long-term as it took to overturn Roe. But at this moment, I think pro-life Americans are needed more than ever. This is no longer about petitioning the Supreme Court over and over and over again and hoping to break through. This is about convincing people on a grassroots level, showing our neighbors, our fellow citizens that something's not right here. So I'd encourage you today to consider these questions. What can we do here and now to build a culture of life? Who around me needs my witness or my support to build a pro-life community? And how can I prepare myself to help those around me understand how deeply abortion has harmed us? I really believe that each of us has an individual calling within the pro-life movement. Even if this has never been your big issue before, everybody is needed in this moment. So I'd encourage you to embrace your part courageously. Thank you.
We will now have questions, so if you can raise your hand, we will come to you and make sure.
Thank you. I'm just curious, here in their conclusions, you made the statement that most abortions are sought by women who feel pressured or unsupported by the father, and that also most are outside of wedlock, right? Can you quantify that at all?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I do know that if you look at, particularly with regard to the first data point, if you look at studies where women say why they seek an abortion, a plurality of the women mention lack of support from the child's father. And then separately, there are a number of surveys suggesting that many women get an abortion under duress, essentially, right? Either pressure or actual physical coercion, whether from their parents or the father of the child. But I don't have specific numbers off the top of my head. Sorry. I've written on it, so you can Google my name and try to sort through my articles if you want to.
Hi. I agree with you that we have to have alternatives to just opposing abortion, but it seems that from a conservative point of view, there's a real dearth of good policy proposals out there that fill that void. For example, the default position seems to be to just spend more money on women's health care and all these other things, but that's not a viable conservative position either. Who is doing research and work on policies that answer your question to provide support to women and families and marriage outside the realm of just saying no to abortion? And I think in this room, it's full of people who work and advocate for these pregnancy crisis centers and do all sorts of work, often with private funds. But I've yet to see a good policy response pro-woman that comes from a conservative point of view that can help answer some of these questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'll give just two examples that I can think of off the top of my head. The first is, so before Dobbs even happened, when Texas passed its heartbeat bill that ended up able to stand, I think 2019. They passed at the same time a $100 million bill called the Alternatives to Abortion Act. And this allocated $100 million to a huge set of resources in the state that, parents, families, mothers, single mothers could avail themselves of to basically try and decrease the desire for abortion. So this could be anything from legal help to, help finding further education or helping crisis pregnancy centers. I think a model like that would be a great thing for other states to take a look at, particularly at the state level rather than the federal level. In my view, that's a better way to do it. And then secondly, for further research, a couple of my colleagues at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Patrick Brown is the main one who comes to mind, does a lot of work on family policy and how to support family in a way that doesn't lead to too much big government in a way that actually harms families, basically. How do we kind of thread the needle there? So he's more of an expert on that than I am. You could look up his work, Patrick Brown.
Thank you. That was really very interesting, and I'm always on the UPP site, so that's good to know. Two things, and I don't mean this sarcastically. Why is it that women who are seeking such equality and the same freedom as men, why do they not simply seek to have hysterectomies? I haven't seen anything about that ever, but not to be uncharitable, but wouldn't that solve their problem? That's a rhetorical question. And my real question is, do you know of any program out there to support those fathers who really do want to have their children but are excluded from the decision that the mother makes to have an abortion? I mean, I've been trying to research this myself, and I'm coming up with bupkis, so maybe you're better than I am here.
Yeah. So as to your first question, it's interesting because immediately after the Dobbs case came down, there were a handful of news articles of women saying, I better go get sterilized, right? Or women saying, we're going to go on a sex strike until the laws are, pro-abortion again. I'm thinking, okay, so they do see there's a connection here, right? The logic is there. But I think the hysterectomy point is that's not reversible, right? And many of these women want to have children on their terms. So if they don't want one today and they're pregnant, they want abortion, but 10 years from now, if they want a child, they're going to get one by any means necessary, right?
The child as an accessory,
right?
As opposed to
kind of a commodity, the commodification, I think, of children. And then as to your second point, I'm not familiar with anything like that, unfortunately. I don't know of any resource like that. And I always say in my talks, I almost always get a question, particularly from students, how can men talk about abortion? And I always say, just talk about abortion, right? The number one way to stop abortion is if the fathers of children, of mothers who are considering abortion, support them. Right now, it's not going to work every single time, but that's a huge thing to do if more men were stepping up and supporting mothers in unexpected pregnancies. So I wish something like that existed, but unfortunately, I think the logic of abortion as a women's issue has made it impossible for men to have a say in any meaningful way. And I think that's actually made it much worse for women on the whole.
Alexandra, thank you for your excellent book, Tearing Us Apart. Two questions related. Do you agree that Republican candidates after June 24th last year largely ran away from the abortion issue? And do you see any possibility of progress of Republican candidates adopting your broad arguments and being able to make that case effectively?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I definitely agree that by and large Republicans ran away from the pro-life issue. And I think what we saw in the midterms, there's been this narrative, I think, from people who are not very well versed in the issue, claiming that abortion cost Republicans in the midterms. If you look at the evidence, the most pro-life governors in the country all either won or won re-election by enormous margins, well ahead of other Republicans running in their state after signing very protective pro-life laws. So the idea that there's some kind of major backlash to the pro-life argument, I don't think is true. I think the stronger argument is Republicans who refuse to counter the lies of Democrats on abortion were portrayed as woman haters, and the left got away with it because they didn't say, we don't hate women, right? We want women to get necessary health care, whatever the argument is. Republicans did not step up and counter the lies of the left on abortion. I think that's what hurt them. Now, as to whether they're going to learn their lesson and get better at it, I don't know. My hope is that, the argument Ryan and I made or other similar arguments coming from the pro-life movement will help Republicans figure out how to talk about this issue more effectively. I don't think it's very hard to do. It just requires a little bit of thought and learning and effort. But I think, unfortunately, many Republicans are afraid of the issue, and they're afraid of being called anti-woman. And so they just assume it's a political loser and run away from it. If I knew a way of getting them to take it seriously, I would do it. But yeah, I just don't know.
Thank you, Alexandra, for your comments and all the work you're doing. Really appreciate it. My name is Joseph Lacani. I'm a visiting professor here at Grove City. I live in Washington, D.C., and I've been in the conservative movement for the better part of 30 years. And I've never seen the conservative movement, and I mean that in the political sense, but also the religious conservative movement, Christian conservative movement. I've never really seen it more militant and pugilistic than it is right now. And Grove City is a great exception to that. That's one of the reasons I'm so grateful to be here. But it seems to me that the one thing you said at the beginning, we need to be a welcoming community for women and for men. And it seems to me that we're probably less ready to do that than we've been in a generation in terms of the militancy and the pugilism and the rhetoric. What is your response to that, and what do we do about it? Yeah,
I definitely agree in terms of the kind of broader political right-wing world context. I definitely see the same thing. I don't know if the same is true of the pro-life movement specifically. I think the pro-life movement has done a very, very good job of laying the groundwork, particularly at the grassroots level, there are thousands and thousands of pregnancy resource centers in this country that have been up and running long before Roe was overturned. And I think having that there is a huge thing, and that women know they can go there. But there's always more that can be done to make our argument more welcoming, but I think our side more welcoming. But I think the main problem for the pro-life movement is so much of what people see about the issue is commandeered by the other side. And so pro-lifers are so often slandered as being, hating women, only caring about babies until they're born, all that sort of thing. It's very hard to counter that unless you have an equally loud megaphone, and we just don't. So I think I agree with you as a broader matter, but among pro-lifers, I don't see as much of an issue, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Alexandra. Hey, so yesterday I was trying to make the argument, but I don't know the policy solution, that we don't focus enough on family breakdown. And as you mentioned, it's something like 85% of all abortions occur outside of marriage. And so, I've thought of and offered a few solutions to this, but, catalyzed by no-fault divorce policy and all the ways in which it's just so easy to move in and out of marriage, but we don't even, speak to the value of family, especially two-parent heterosexual family unit. And you mentioned, this is a huge issue in relation to the abortion, but are there ways in which we can make some headway here? I mean, I'm kind of stumped, besides, maybe some basic educational programs. How do we make a dent in that problem?
Yeah, it's hard because I think we could come up with policy solutions, but it's really a cultural, the problem is rooted in culture. And for those of you who were at Dr. Truman's talk last night, I think he hit the nail on the head that we're just swimming in this culture of the self, right? And so the idea of a committed marriage for raising children doesn't make very much sense in that context anymore, unless it's something that people want to do for their own flourishing. They're just going to drift in and out of marriage or never get married at all. And so I think that really shifting the tide of the culture is much harder, but will have a much more lasting effect. In terms of policy, this is not my expertise, but I know there are conservatives who are trying to come up with policies that incentivize getting married or incentivize having children. I think that would probably help a bit around the edges, but I don't really think at the end of the day, getting a check from the government or, having a child tax credit is going to stop abortion, right? Like that might shape the culture a little bit, but it doesn't go all the way to the root of the problem, unfortunately, yeah.
Do you think that the influx of immigrants coming into our country from predominantly Catholic countries will influence the whole argument on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's possible in the sense that only because I think there are broader signs of a demographic shift in how people are voting on issues even other than abortion. Like, for example, I think the Hispanic vote typically is going to be very pro-life, but also right now is typically very democratic. But I think we're seeing reasons to think that might be shifting, and that could very well end up affecting the abortion issue. I mean, public opinion on abortion today is not going to be public opinion in a year or 5 years from now. Especially because the strongest argument of the other side was, if Roe goes away, it's going to be a hellscape, women are going to be dying everywhere, it's going to be horrible. None of that is happening, right? People are living in states with pro-life laws. There are not women dying in back alleys. Everyone's basically fine, right? And so I think they're going to be proven to be liars on that. And I think that will probably have a bigger effect in the long term than demographic change, but that could definitely be a part of it.
Thank you for your discussion, Alexander. I just wanted to pull the string on a couple points raised, indulge in a bit of mansplaining. One thing I do agree with is that, like Republicans, I think because men don't have rights in the abortion decision, they feel like they also can't have an opinion. Yeah. And picking up on one of your points, I mean, I've had this personally in my life with friends of mine. The last thing a woman who comes to you who's pregnant wants to hear is, well, whatever you want to do, I'll support. What they want to hear is, because they wouldn't have come to you anyway, is, I will be there for you. I will help to support the child. They want, the man to be a man. On the other side, I think you're very right that the sexual revolution changed the dynamic of how women view abortion. And one of my pet theories is that I think because it really objectified and turned women into sexual objects, I think the problem is this is this mistaken conception that they feel this is how they recapture their sexuality and autonomy and freedom through abortion. Yeah. And damn it, if the men are already using me for my bodies and abandoning me. Damn it, if you take this right away from me, what else do I have? And I'm just wondering, in your own research, if you've found that from women, or if that's under the surface. Yeah,
that's a good point. I do think there's something to that in the sense that women are, by and large, much less happy with the, let's call it, sexual revolution status quo than men. Which makes sense, right? Men, not that men are flourishing or anything, but they're much less harmed than women just because of the way men naturally are by the fact that there's less marriage, less commitment, more casual sex. Women are typically not happy with that scenario. Women want commitment. But I think most women don't think they have any other option. This is just the playing field. And so in that context, it makes perfect sense to me why you'd feel disadvantaged not to have access to abortion. Right now, of course, it's a moral evil and it's not a good thing for women. But I can see why, if you think this sexual landscape is the only world that, the water you're swimming in, why it would be unfair to women to take abortion away. And that's kind of the genesis of my remarks, right? We have to get at that deeper problem if we're going to convince people, but especially women, that they don't need abortion. So I think you're right.
Alexandra, recently, I think it was this month, in Wisconsin, a pro-abortion judge was elected to the Supreme Court. Yeah. And there was a lot of publicity about how that indicated that the pro-abortion stance is very favorable. But you mentioned a few moments ago that not so much. And any other comments about the opportunity these days for people like us to push back against the pro-abortion political stance?
Yeah, sure. So with regard to Wisconsin specifically, I think it's important to note that her opponent, so that the pro-abortion candidate won, her opponent had lost in 2020 as an incumbent by 10 points. And he lost this time by 11. So I don't think that abortion was the deciding factor in that race at all. And that's kind of been brushed under the rug by people who want to claim this was a big pro-abortion win. So you can look at the past results for that. But more broadly, my argument has been, I think the main problem for the pro-life movement, but specifically the Republican Party since Dobbs, has been an unwillingness from politicians who call themselves pro-life to counter the lies of the other side. And I mentioned this in my remarks, but what we've heard from abortion supporters has not been abortion through all 9 months is wonderful, right? That's a very easy argument to prove unpopular. Nobody supports that, really. Americans don't support that. They've been saying Republicans are okay if women die. They want to ban all abortions, even if it leads to women dying in emergency, situations. That is not true of pro-life laws. How many Republican politicians did you see making coherent arguments about how Democrats were lying or how the media was lying? I saw one, maybe zero. I don't know. I don't remember any particularly compelling ones. Republicans did not talk about the issue. And so you can't refuse to talk about abortion and then turn around and say, oh, it's my abortion stance that lost me the election. No, right? It's that you didn't learn how to talk about it. You didn't take seriously the fact that you have an opportunity to expose the other side as the real extremists. You didn't speak about it in a compassionate, compelling way. You can't blame that on abortion, right? So for pro-lifers, I think it's important, if you have an opportunity to talk to your representatives or to talk to people in the party or whatever it is, wherever you are, encourage them to learn how to speak about this issue, right? There's this huge vacuum. Americans are waiting to be convinced, and all they're hearing is lies from the other side. And if we don't counter it, of course those lies are going to win.
I have been made aware when you mentioned about lies that one of the comments that was being made by the so-called providers of abortions, they keep pushing the concept that this is women's health that is going to be affected, and how dangerous it is if we no longer provide that. And then recently, it came out that there wasn't one mammogram machine in any of the abortion clinics. Is that true? And if so, could you mention about that?
Yeah, so I think, I'm not sure if there's something more recent than this, but I think a few years ago, the president of Planned Parenthood, which is, of course, the biggest abortion provider in the country, was claiming that Planned Parenthood provides mammograms, and it turned out, due to a pro-life expose, they actually didn't have mammogram machines anywhere. They might have had 5 in the entire country or something like that. And if you look at the Planned Parenthood annual report, the abortions they provide compared to things like prenatal care or adoption referrals, I mean, the ratio is so skewed. I think it's something like 43 abortions for every 1 instance of prenatal care, off the top of my head. I might be wrong. So it's very clearly an abortion business. And that's something Ryan and I write about in one of our chapters, that this notion of abortion as healthcare has captured the public imagination to the point where now, if you oppose abortion, you're accused of wanting women to die or not caring about women's health. what healthcare situation requires directly killing an unborn child? None, right? If you ask any straight doctor, they're not going to be able to name a single one, because it's never necessary to directly kill the unborn child. Even if you have to care for the mother and the baby might inadvertently die, unintentionally, that's not an abortion. And so I think the other side has really been capitalizing, frankly, on our side's silence to get away with those lies. So.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
One of the things that I hear, like, I have a friend that says, I know you're pro-life, but you're really just pro-birth. Because what kind of life are they going to have? They'll get into the system. Nobody wants them. Who's going to feed them? and all of that. My response to her was, who are we to determine the destiny of a child?
Yeah.
God did that. We don't. How would you counter something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's a very common argument, so it's important to know how to respond to that. Typically what I say are two things. One is, whose life is without suffering, right? None of us have never suffered. None of us has a perfect life. Now, of course, some kinds of suffering are particularly egregious, but you can't say at the beginning of someone's life that from day from day one the kind of suffering they're going to endure such that it's better to just kill them now, right? What about the joyful moments? That it's not normal to say we should kill people because they might suffer. Relatedly, if someone gets a cancer diagnosis, we're not a society that would advocate shooting them, right? We don't cure cancer by killing people with cancer. We don't cure poverty by shooting poor people, right? Killing people is not a solution to suffering. Now, maybe there's more we could do as a society or a community to help people in these types of circumstances. That's a separate argument. But we don't actually solve any of the problems named by killing people. That's not what a humane society does. Yeah.
This will be our last question.
Sounds good.
This is less of a question than just sort of an observation. I've been sitting here and I've been thinking that on a political spectrum, on the political point of view, the political drive to do things like defund the police is quite similar to the drive to make unfettered abortion available everywhere to everyone. I don't think it's going to hurt the elite, who are by and large getting married, at least eventually not having abortions and having their own children.
Yeah.
It seems to me it hurts the people who can least afford to have that dysfunction in their lives.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And this is something we talk about in the third chapter of our book. We talk about how abortion has hindered social equality, far from helping it. And one of the statistics we mention is something like 80% of Planned Parenthoods in the country are located within walking distance of Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. And sadly, the left will point to that statistic and celebrate like we're doing this great service for people. And I want to say, if Black and Hispanic women are feeling the need to kill their own children in order to survive, that's something we need to address by actually helping these communities, right? Not by building more abortion clinics. And I think, unfortunately, the other side is not willing to grapple with that. But we have to, more evidence, we have to be able to explain how abortion is not actually a solution, right? If people feel the need to kill their own children, that's not a solution for whatever problem they might be facing. Thank you all.